When the last salvos of the Great Patriotic War died down in the West, an operation began in the Far East that few know about today. In August 1945, while Europe was recovering from the ruins, Soviet troops were preparing for a decisive strike against Japan. The Kuril amphibious operation became the final chord of World War II, the last dot in humanity's bloodiest conflict. This page of history, written on the rocky shores of distant islands, long remained in the shadow of the Red Army's resounding victories. The islands, stretching in a chain from Kamchatka to Japan, became an arena of fierce battles where every meter of land was taken with a fight, despite Japan's official surrender. Here, among volcanic rocks and fogs, Soviet soldiers and sailors, many of whom had fought the entire war from Moscow to Berlin, once again found themselves face to face with death. For them, the war did not end in May. Another trial awaited them, one that forever changed the geopolitical map of the region and became a symbolic end to the era of the global conflagration. The Kuril Islands are not just dots on a map. They are a strategic key to domination in the northern Pacific Ocean, a natural barrier between the continent and the ocean's expanses. This volcanic ridge of 30 large islands and numerous rocks, stretching for 1,200 kilometers from Kamchatka to Japan's Hokkaido, has for centuries been a bone of contention between two powers. The history of confrontation over these lands dates back to the 18th century, when Russian pioneers began to develop these harsh shores. By the mid-19th century, the Russian Empire had solidified its rights to the archipelago. However, defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904–5 changed the status quo. According to the Treaty of Portsmouth, Japan received not only southern Sakhalin, but also control over all the Kuril Islands. For the Japanese Empire, the Kurils were not just a territorial acquisition. They became a powerful outpost from which to control approaches to the Soviet Far East. From these islands, the Japanese could observe the movement of Soviet ships, block access to the Pacific Ocean, and even threaten Kamchatka and Primorye. The strategic importance of the Kurils only increased with the development of aviation and the submarine fleet. The Japanese command transformed the islands into a true fortress. Airfields were built here, from which bombers could take off to strike Soviet territory. Submarine bases, capable of severing sea communications, were located in the bays. Each island became a link in the defensive chain protecting the approaches to the Japanese metropolis. For the Soviet Union, the return of the Kurils was not only a matter of historical justice, but also a vital necessity. Without control over the archipelago, the Pacific Fleet found itself locked in its bases, deprived of the ability to freely access the ocean. The Far Eastern borders remained vulnerable to potential attack, which, amidst escalating Japanese aggression, created a constant threat to the country's security. It is not surprising that the Soviet leadership considered the return of the Kuril Islands as one of the priority tasks of its Far Eastern policy. However, until the defeat of Nazi Germany, the resolution of this issue was postponed. The main forces and resources were thrown into the fight against the Hitlerite coalition. February 1945, the Crimean coast, the Levadia Palace. It was here, in the former summer residence of the Russian Tsars, that the fate of the post-war world order was decided. The Yalta Conference brought together the leaders of three great powers: Joseph Stalin, Franklin Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill. Against the backdrop of the Red Army's successes on the European front, the Americans and British increasingly pressed for the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan. For the Western Allies, this was of critical importance. Despite successes in the Pacific Campaign, the prospect of invading the Japanese islands caused serious concerns. American command predicted colossal losses in the assault on the Japanese metropolis, up to 1 million soldiers. The USSR's participation in the war against Japan could significantly accelerate its capitulation and save thousands of American and British soldiers' lives. The Soviet leadership was well aware of its trump cards in this diplomatic game. Stalin agreed to enter the war against Japan 2 to 3 months after Germany's capitulation, but put forward clear conditions. One of the key demands was the return of territories lost by Russia after its defeat in the Russo-Japanese War: southern Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. On February 8, 1945, a secret agreement was signed between the USSR, the USA, and Great Britain. The document, known as the Quote, recorded the fundamental understanding. This short formulation laid the legal basis for the future Kuril operation. It is curious that the American side initially did not object to Soviet demands. Roosevelt, weakened by illness, less than 2 months remained until his death, understood the strategic importance of a speedy end to the war. Churchill showed greater caution, fearing an increase in Soviet influence in Asia, but ultimately also signed the agreement. The Yalta agreements remained secret from the Japanese government. Tokyo hoped until the last moment for the possibility of concluding a separate peace with the Western Allies, counting on contradictions within the anti-Hitler coalition. Japanese diplomacy even attempted to use the Soviet Union as a mediator in peace negotiations, unaware of the secret agreements of Yalta. For the Soviet command, the Yalta agreements became a signal to begin preparing a large-scale operation in the Far East. Already in March 1945, plans for the liberation of southern Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands began to be developed. The General Staff began transferring troops from the European theater of war to the east. The Pacific Fleet began preparing for amphibious operations. However, the diplomatic history of the Kuril operation also had its pitfalls. After Roosevelt's death in April 1945, the new U.S. President, Harry Truman, took a tougher stance on the USSR. The American side began to reinterpret the Yalta agreements, especially after successful atomic bomb tests. Hope emerged for a quick capitulation of Japan without Soviet involvement. Despite these changes, the Soviet Union firmly adhered to the agreements reached. On April 5, 1945, the USSR denounced the Neutrality Pact with Japan, signaling impending changes in its Far Eastern policy. For the Japanese leadership, this was an alarming sign, although Tokyo still did not fully grasp the scale of the impending catastrophe. The development of the plan for the Kuril amphibious operation began in the spring of 1945, immediately after the cessation of hostilities in Europe. The General Staff of the Red Army entrusted this most complex task to the command of the Pacific Fleet and the Second Far Eastern Front. The military leaders faced a task of unprecedented complexity: to prepare an amphibious operation with virtually no experience of such actions in the Pacific theater of operations. Planning the operation was complicated by a severe shortage of intelligence data. The Soviet command had only fragmentary information about Japanese fortifications on the islands. Aerial photography provided limited information due to frequent fogs and cloud cover that concealed the archipelago most of the time. Agent intelligence in the Kurils was practically impossible. The Japanese meticulously controlled movement on the islands and in the adjacent waters. The geography of the archipelago presented a separate problem: rocky shores, steep ascents from the waterline, and the absence of convenient bays for landing. All these factors made a classic amphibious operation extremely risky. Most of the islands were of volcanic origin, with characteristic terrain, high central peaks and steep slopes descending to the sea. Such terrain gave a significant advantage to the defenders. The climatic conditions of the Kuril Islands also posed a serious challenge. Even in August, the weather here remained unpredictable. Sudden storms, thick fogs, and strong tides could disrupt the operation at any moment. The water temperature, even in summer, did not rise above 10 degrees Celsius, making prolonged exposure to it mortally dangerous for the landing forces. Despite all the difficulties, by early August 1945, the operation plan was ready. The main strike was decided to be delivered to Shumshu Island, the northernmost and most fortified in the Kuril Ridge. The capture of this key island opened the way to the rest of the archipelago. A special operational group was formed for the operation under the command of Major General Alexei Gnechko. It included units of the Kamchatka Defensive Region, ships of the Petropavlovsk Naval Base, and aviation of the Pacific Fleet. In total, about 9,000 personnel, several dozen guns and mortars were allocated for the landing. Special attention was paid to the preparation of the first echelon of the landing, the Marines of the Pacific Fleet. It was they who were to be the first to step onto the enemy shore and establish a bridgehead. Training was conducted in conditions as close as possible to combat, on the rocky shores of Kamchatka, in all weather conditions. The most difficult task was to provide the operation with transport vehicles. The Pacific Fleet experienced a severe shortage of specialized landing craft. They had to use what was at hand: fishing seiners, civilian steamships, barges. Many of these vessels were not adapted for amphibious operations and required urgent modification. By mid-August 1945, preparations entered their final phase. Troops and ships were concentrated in the Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky area. Marines and riflemen conducted their final training. Technicians and engineers worked around the clock to prepare transport vehicles. Intelligence continued to gather information about the enemy. On the night of August 18, 1945, the landing detachment departed Avacha Bay and set course for Shumshu Island. Ahead of them lay the last battle of World War II, a battle that would forever change the geopolitical map of the region and become the final chord of the most terrible war in human history. By August 1945, the Kuril Islands represented a true bastion of Japanese defense. The Imperial Command, recognizing the strategic importance of the archipelago, transformed this volcanic ridge into an impregnable fortress. Each island became a link in a powerful defensive system designed to protect the northern approaches to the Japanese metropolis. The Japanese 91st Infantry Division, forming the core of the Kuril garrison, was an elite unit of the Imperial Army. Its soldiers underwent special training for combat operations in harsh northern conditions. Many soldiers and officers were natives of Hokkaido and the northern prefectures of Japan, which made them especially resilient in the Kuril climate. The total number of Japanese troops in the archipelago exceeded 80,000 men, an impressive force capable of prolonged defense. The Japanese paid particular attention to fortifying Shumshu Island, the northern gateway to the Kuril Ridge. A true underground citadel was created here. In the rocky terrain of the volcanic island, engineer units cut through kilometers of tunnels, connecting firing positions, barracks, and warehouses. Many fortifications were located at a depth of up to 30 meters, making them invulnerable to artillery fire and aerial bombardments. The coastline of the islands was literally riddled with firing positions. Artillery batteries were placed in reinforced concrete caponiers and carefully camouflaged positions. Many guns were installed in caves with narrow embrasures, making them practically invisible from the sea. The fire system was organized to cover all possible landing directions. On Shumshu and other key islands, the Japanese built a network of airfields capable of accommodating both fighters and bombers. These runways were carefully camouflaged and often located in natural topographical depressions, protecting them from detection from the air. By August 1945, about 200 aircraft of various types were based at the Kuril airfields. A particular threat to a potential landing was posed by Japanese tank units. A separate tank regiment was stationed on Shumshu, armed with Ha-Go light tanks and Chi-Ha medium tanks. Although these vehicles were inferior to the latest Soviet tanks, in the confined spaces of the islands and with infantry support, they could pose a serious problem for the landing forces. It is noteworthy that the Japanese command paid special attention to the morale of the garrison. Officers instilled in the soldiers that the Kuril Islands were the last line of defense of the sacred land of the empire. Many units swore to fight to the last man, even in the event of Japan's general surrender. This explains the fact that even after the imperial rescript to cease resistance, many units continued to fight fiercely. The Japanese command created significant reserves of food, ammunition, and fuel on the islands. Underground warehouses were designed to ensure a long defense, up to several months of intense fighting. This allowed the garrison to conduct autonomous combat operations, even under conditions of a complete naval and air blockade. The surveillance and communication system in the archipelago was also organized at a high level. Observation posts, equipped with optical devices and radar stations, were located on high ground. This allowed the Japanese to control a vast expanse of water and timely detect the approach of enemy ships and aircraft. To conduct the Kuril operation, Soviet command formed a powerful grouping of troops and naval forces. The core of the landing detachments consisted of units from the Kamchatka defensive region and subdivisions of the 16th Army of the Second Far Eastern Front. A special role in the operation was to be played by the Pacific Fleet's naval infantry, elite units specifically trained for combat operations on the coast. The main striking force of the landing was the 101st Rifle Division under the command of Major General Dyakov. Its soldiers underwent special training in landing on an undeveloped coast and conducting combat in mountainous terrain. Many officers and soldiers of this formation had combat experience on the Western Front behind them, which made the division particularly valuable in the upcoming battles. The naval component of the operation was provided by a detachment of Pacific Fleet ships. It included minesweepers, patrol ships, torpedo boats, and landing barges. The Fleet Command also allocated several submarines for the operation, which were to conduct reconnaissance and, if necessary, strike Japanese ships. The preparation of the landing detachments was carried out in an atmosphere of strict secrecy. Even many mid-level commanders did not know the exact objective of the operation until the last moment. Training exercises were conducted on the Kamchatka coast, whose relief resembled the Kuril shores. Soldiers practiced landing from ships onto an undeveloped shore, overcoming steep, rocky slopes, and conducting combat in conditions of limited visibility. Special attention was paid to interaction between different branches of service. Infantrymen learned to adjust naval artillery fire, aviation practiced techniques for supporting ground forces in difficult terrain and unpredictable weather conditions. Signalmen trained in ensuring stable communication between ships and the landing force, which was critically important for the success of the operation. A most difficult task was adapting soldiers who arrived from the Western Front to the new conditions. Many of them were accustomed to fighting on the flat terrain of Europe and now had to reorient themselves to operations in the mountains and on the coast. Furthermore, they were to face an enemy whose tactics and psychology differed significantly from the Germans. An important element of preparation was studying the experience of American landing operations in the Pacific. Soviet officers thoroughly analyzed information about landings on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Particular attention was paid to the Allies' mistakes and successes to avoid repeating the former and utilize the latter in their own operation. The logistical support for the landing also required special attention. Each soldier received an enhanced ration, a supply of drinking water, and additional ammunition. given the possibility of prolonged battles, supplies of food, medicine, and ammunition were created, which were to be delivered to the islands following the first echelons of the landing. By mid-August 1945, the preparation of the landing detachments was completed. The troops concentrated in the Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky area in full combat readiness. Commanders conducted final briefings, and staffs clarified the details of the operation plan. Soldiers checked their weapons and equipment, preparing for the decisive thrust. On the night of August 18, 1945, the landing detachment boarded ships and set course for Shimushu Island. Ahead of them lay the last battle of World War II, which would put the final point in humanity's bloodiest conflict. August 18, 1945. The sky over Kamchatka had not yet begun to lighten when the landing party, commanded by Major General Alexei Gnechko, exited Avacha Bay. 88 ships and vessels of various classes set course for Shumshu Island. In the pre-dawn gloom, sailors and paratroopers peered at the horizon, trying to discern the outlines of the enemy shore. Many of them had fought through the entire war from Moscow to Berlin, but it was here, at the edge of the world, that they were destined to put the final period to the bloodiest conflict of the 20th century. The weather seemed to test the landing's resilience. A strong northeasterly wind raised waves up to 2 meters high. Heavy leaden clouds hung over the sea, occasionally pouring cold rain. Visibility constantly changed, sometimes dropping to a few hundred meters due to thick fog, then briefly improving. For many fighters, this was their first sea voyage, and the pitching quickly incapacitated even the sturdiest. At 5 in the morning, the lead ships of the landing party approached the northeastern coast of Shumshu Island. It became clear that the element of surprise had failed. The Japanese had detected the approach of the Soviet ships. Signal flares ignited on the shore, and soon after, coastal batteries opened fire. Shells raised columns of water around the landing craft, but the accuracy of the Japanese fire was reduced by poor visibility. The commander of the advanced detachment, Major Pokhtarev, decided not to wait for the main forces and to begin the landing immediately. The first to rush to the shore were 12 landing barges carrying Marines. Under the cover of naval artillery fire, they overcame the last few hundred meters to the shore. The Japanese maintained a hurricane of fire from all types of weapons. The sea around the barges boiled with explosions, but the paratroopers continued their advance. The first wave of the landing, about 1,000 fighters, under the command of Major Shutov, landed on a narrow strip of pebble beach. Without lingering under enemy fire, the Marines quickly crossed the open ground and began to climb the steep slopes. Every meter was gained through fierce fighting. The Japanese had turned the coastal heights into a veritable fortress with numerous firing points. Of particular danger were the Japanese pillboxes, skillfully camouflaged among the rocks and vegetation. From these reinforced concrete fortifications, the enemy maintained crossfire, creating a veritable hail of lead. The paratroopers literally had to dig into the ground, using every fold of terrain to advance. At 7 in the morning, the second echelon of the landing force disembarked. Now, Soviet troops could develop the offensive deeper into the island. The main objective was Height 171, a key position in the Japanese defense. Seizing this commanding height would open the way to the enemy's main fortifications and airfield. The Japanese command quickly realized the threat and threw their main reserve, a tank regiment, into a counterattack. 18 medium tanks, supported by infantry, advanced on the paratroopers' positions. For the Soviet soldiers, this was a real test. Anti-tank weapons were catastrophically scarce, and those that existed proved ineffective against the frontal armor of the Japanese vehicles. At a critical moment of the battle, Senior Lieutenant Ponomarev's artillery battery distinguished itself. Wheeling their guns into direct fire, the artillerymen opened fire on the advancing tanks. Ponomarev himself personally destroyed 3 vehicles, setting an example of courage for his men. The other artillerymen also acted heroically. Despite losses, they continued to fire, stopping the Japanese tanks one by one. By noon, the situation had stabilized. Soviet paratroopers had consolidated their captured positions and repelled several fierce enemy counterattacks. However, further progress stalled due to losses, ammunition shortages, and soldier fatigue. The Japanese, despite significant losses, continued stubborn resistance. Particularly fierce battles unfolded for Height 171. A small group of Marines, led by Lieutenant Vilkov, managed to break through to the summit, but found themselves surrounded by superior enemy forces. Having exhausted all ammunition, the paratroopers engaged in hand-to-hand combat. Lieutenant Vilkov and Sergeant Ilyichev covered the embrasures of Japanese pillboxes with their bodies, repeating the feat of Alexander Matrosov and ensuring the advance of their comrades. By the end of August 18th, Soviet forces had firmly established themselves on the northern coast of Shumshu Island, creating a bridgehead up to 4 kilometers deep. The Japanese, despite significant losses, continued to hold the central and southern parts of the island, including the airfield and main fortified areas. Ahead, the paratroopers faced new fierce battles, the last battles of World War II. 18th of August, 1945. The sky over Kamchatka had not yet begun to lighten when the landing force, commanded by Major General Alexei Gnechko, departed Avacha Bay. 88 ships and vessels of various classes set course for Shumshu Island. In the pre-dawn gloom, sailors and Marines peered into the horizon, trying to discern the outline of the enemy shore. Many of them had fought through the entire war from Moscow to Berlin, but it was here, at the edge of the world, that they were to deliver the final blow in the bloodiest conflict of the 20th century. The weather seemed to test the landing force's resilience. A strong northeast wind whipped up waves up to 2 meters high. Heavy, leaden clouds hung over the sea, occasionally drenching them in cold rain. Visibility constantly changed, at times dropping to a few hundred meters due to thick fog, then briefly improving. At 5 o'clock in the morning, the lead ships of the landing force approached the northeastern coast of Shumshu Island. It became clear that the element of surprise had been lost. The Japanese had detected the approach of the Soviet ships. Signal flares ignited on the shore, and shortly thereafter, coastal batteries opened fire. Shells raised columns of water around the landing craft, but the accuracy of Japanese fire was diminished by poor visibility. The commander of the advance party, Major Pokhtarev, decided not to wait for the main forces to arrive and to begin the landing immediately. The first to rush to the shore were 12 landing barges carrying naval infantry. Under the cover of ship artillery fire, they overcame the last few hundred meters to the shore. The Japanese unleashed a hurricane of fire from all types of weapons. The sea around the barges boiled from explosions, but the landing troops continued their advance. The first wave of the landing, about 1,000 soldiers, under the command of Major Shutov, landed on a narrow strip of pebble beach. Without lingering under enemy fire, the naval infantry quickly crossed the open ground and began to ascend the steep slopes. Every meter was gained with a fight. The Japanese had transformed the coastal heights into a veritable fortress with numerous firing positions. At 7 o'clock in the morning, the second echelon of the landing force disembarked. Now, Soviet troops could develop an offensive deeper into the island. The main objective became Height 171, a key position in the Japanese defense. Capturing this dominant height opened the way to the enemy's main fortifications and airfield. The Japanese command quickly realized the threat and threw its main reserve, a tank regiment, into a counterattack. 18 medium tanks, supported by infantry, advanced on the positions of the landing forces. For the Soviet soldiers, this was a true test. Anti-tank weapons were critically scarce, and those they had proved largely ineffective against the frontal armor of the Japanese vehicles. At a critical moment of the battle, Senior Lieutenant Ponomarev's artillery battery distinguished itself. Wheeling their guns into direct fire, the artillerymen opened fire on the advancing tanks. Ponomarev himself personally knocked out 3 vehicles, setting an example of courage for his men. The other artillerymen also acted heroically. Despite losses, they continued to fire, stopping Japanese tanks one after another. Particularly fierce fighting unfolded for Height 171. A small group of naval infantry under the command of Lieutenant Vilkov managed to break through to the summit, but found themselves surrounded by superior enemy forces. Having exhausted all ammunition, the landing troops engaged in hand-to-hand combat. Lieutenant Vilkov and Petty Officer Ilyichev, at the cost of their lives, ensured the advance of their comrades, covering the embrasures of enemy pillboxes with their bodies. By the end of the first day of fighting, Soviet troops had secured a bridgehead up to 4 kilometers deep, but further advance stalled. The Japanese, despite the Emperor's order to surrender, continued fierce resistance. Another day of bloody fighting lay ahead. August 21st, 1945. After 2 days of fierce fighting for Shumshu Island, the Japanese command finally decided to surrender. Broken by the stubborn resistance of the Soviet Marines, Lieutenant General Tsutsumi Fusaki, commander of the Japanese garrison, gave the order to cease fire. This marked a turning point in the entire Kuril operation. The key outpost of Japanese defense had fallen, opening the way to the remaining islands of the archipelago. On the same day, the systematic liberation of the central Kuril Islands began. Unlike Shumshu, Soviet troops encountered no serious resistance here. Japanese garrisons, having received news of the fall of the northern outpost and following the imperial decree of surrender, laid down their arms upon the appearance of Soviet ships. On August 23rd, a landing party commanded by Captain First Rank Leonov disembarked on Matua Island. This island held particular strategic importance. A large Japanese airbase was located there. The island's garrison, numbering about 3,500 men, surrendered without a single shot. Soviet troops captured rich spoils, several dozen aircraft, artillery batteries, and warehouses with ammunition and food. On August 24th, the liberation of Urup Island began, one of the largest in the central part of the Kuril Ridge. The commander of the Japanese garrison, Colonel Takeda, fulfilling the imperial decree, met the Soviet landing party with a white flag. A solemn surrender ceremony took place in the central square of the island's main settlement. Japanese officers, many with tears in their eyes, laid their samurai swords at the feet of Soviet commanders, a symbolic gesture signifying complete acknowledgement of defeat. Parallel to the liberation of the Central Islands, preparations for the operation in the southern Kurils began. Here were located the largest and most economically developed islands of the archipelago: Iturup, Kunashir, and Shikotan. The Japanese command had created a powerful defense system on them, and there were fears that local garrisons might offer serious resistance, as had been the case on Shumshu. On August 28th, a large landing party commanded by Major General Alexei Gnechko disembarked on Iturup Island, the largest in the Kuril Ridge. To the surprise of the Soviet command, the 8,000-strong Japanese garrison offered no resistance. The garrison commander, General Watanabe, personally met the Soviet officers and declared his readiness to fulfill all surrender terms. Special attention was paid to Kunashir Island, located only a few tens of kilometers from Japanese Hokkaido. There were fears that its proximity to the metropolis might inspire the local garrison to desperate resistance. However, When Soviet ships approached the island's shores on August 29th, they were met by Japanese parliamentarians with white flags. On August 30th, Shikotan Island was liberated, the last of the large islands of the Kuril Ridge. Here too there were no hostilities. The Japanese garrison, following the emperor's order, laid down its arms and became prisoners of war. By September 1st, 1945, all the islands of the Kuril Ridge, from Shumshu in the north to Shikotan in the south, had come under the control of Soviet troops. A distinctive feature of the liberation of the central and southern Kurils was the clear organization of the Japanese troops' surrender process. Special commissions were established on each island to accept documentation, weapons, and military property from the Japanese. Detailed inventories of trophies were compiled, many of which were of significant value: artillery systems, radar stations, fuel and food supplies. An important task was to ensure the safety of the peaceful Japanese population. On many islands, especially the southern ones, a significant number of civilians resided: fishermen, cannery workers, and their families. The Soviet command organized their evacuation to Hokkaido, ensuring a safe passage and the opportunity to take personal belongings with them. Concurrently with military actions, active political work was carried out on the islands. Special groups of political officers explained to the local population and captured Japanese soldiers the reasons for Soviet entry into the war, and spoke about the Yalta Conference decisions, according to which the Kuril Islands were to be returned to the Soviet Union. Many Japanese, who had lived for decades in an atmosphere of militaristic propaganda, learned with surprise the truth about world politics and the real state of affairs on the fronts. The Kuril operation proved to be a true test for the Soviet Union's military logistics. Organizing such a complex amphibious operation in a remote region demanded exceptional coordination of all branches of the armed forces. The key to success was the effective interaction of the Navy, Air Force, and ground forces, each playing its indispensable role in this most challenging military undertaking. The Pacific Fleet ensured the transportation of troops and supplies, provided fire support for the landing, and blockaded Japanese sea communications. The Air Force conducted reconnaissance, struck enemy fortifications, and provided air cover for the landing parties. The ground forces directly carried out the task of capturing and holding the islands. This coordinated effort of the three branches of the armed forces allowed for success in the shortest possible time with minimal losses. A particular difficulty was the delivery of heavy equipment to the undeveloped coast of the islands. Engineering units literally created temporary piers and unloading areas from scratch. Under conditions of heavy seas and the absence of stationary port facilities, each operation to unload tanks and artillery became a unique engineering challenge. Specially equipped landing barges and rafts were used to deliver equipment to shore. Many decisions had to be made on the spot, improvising according to the specific conditions of each island. Transport vessels operated at their limits. Many of them were not designed for landing operations and were converted civilian vessels: fishing trawlers, coastal steamers, barges. Their crews, often consisting of civilian sailors, displayed miracles of skill, maneuvering near dangerous shores in complex navigational conditions. It was especially difficult in the frequent storms and fogs characteristic of the Kuril Islands, even in summer. Supplying the landing parties with ammunition and provisions also posed a serious problem. In the initial stage of the operation, especially during the battles for Shumshu Island, the landing troops often found themselves in a situation of acute ammunition shortage. Emergency delivery of necessary supplies under enemy fire had to be organized. Small, fast boats capable of maneuvering close to the shore were used for this purpose. Sometimes ammunition was even delivered by inflatable boats when other means proved ineffective. Communication between various elements of the landing also required special attention. The mountainous terrain of the islands created serious obstacles for radio communication. To overcome these difficulties, repeaters were installed on the tops of captured heights. In critical situations, signal flares and flag signaling were used. Signalmen often risked their lives, moving to open positions to ensure stable communication between advancing units and command posts. The Air Force of the Pacific Fleet played an indispensable role in the success of the operation. Despite the extremely difficult meteorological conditions of the region, frequent fogs, low clouds, sudden storms, Soviet pilots provided reconnaissance and support for the landings. Il-2 attack aircraft proved particularly effective, delivering pinpoint strikes against Japanese fortifications. Reconnaissance pilots in light Po-2 aircraft made daily flights over the islands, recording the location of Japanese troops and the results of bombings. The medical support for the operation also required unconventional solutions. Temporary medical posts were set up on each landing vessel, where the wounded received first aid. Seriously wounded were evacuated to specially designated hospital ships stationed at a safe distance from the shore. Field hospitals were deployed on the captured bridgeheads, operating in extremely difficult conditions, often in the open air or in hastily equipped shelters. Doctors and nurses, many of whom had served throughout the war from Moscow to Berlin, were now saving the lives of soldiers in this distant corner of the earth. Special mention should be made of the work of hydrographers and meteorologists. In the almost complete absence of accurate maps of the coastal areas of the Kuril Islands, they had to conduct operational reconnaissance, determining the depths and nature of the seabed in the presumed landing sites. Meteorologists monitored changes in weather conditions around the clock. The success of landing operations directly depended on the accuracy of their forecasts. Often, the decision to begin the landing was made literally at the last moment, when a temporary window of favorable weather appeared. After the capture of the islands, the Soviet command faced the task of holding and settling them. Engineering units were engaged in mine clearance of the territory, restoration of roads and bridges, and construction of temporary fortifications. Special attention was paid to ensuring uninterrupted supply to the garrisons, which were to serve on these remote frontiers. Regular voyages of transport vessels were organized, delivering everything necessary for the life support of the troops to the islands. The Kuril operation demonstrated the highest level of military art of the Soviet command and the heroism of ordinary participants. The successful conduct of such a complex amphibious operation in a remote theater of war was made possible by the effective coordination of all branches of the armed forces, the skill of commanders at all levels, and the selflessness of every soldier. The experience gained during this operation formed the basis of Soviet military doctrine for conducting amphibious operations, and was studied for many years in military academies not only in the Soviet Union, but also in many other countries. Behind the dry figures of the Kuril operation's military reports lie the fates of thousands of Soviet soldiers and officers. For them, these far eastern islands became the final trial in the long journey of war. Many participants in the operation endured all 4 years of bloody battles, from the defense of Moscow to the storming of Berlin, survived injuries, the loss of friends, and witnessed death and destruction. And when it seemed that all trials were behind them, they faced yet another, perhaps the most difficult. A detachment of Marines under the command of Major Shutov embodied the entire path of the Soviet soldier in this war. Among his fighters were natives of various republics of the Soviet Union: Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Kazakhs, Georgians. Many of them began the war in the trenches near Moscow, defended in the ruins of Stalingrad, forced the Dnieper and Vistula. Now they were to complete their combat path on the rocky shores of the Kuril Islands. Especially indicative is the story of Major Shutov himself. Before the war, he was an ordinary teacher from a Siberian city. In 41, he volunteered for the front. He rose from private to officer, was wounded twice, and awarded the Orders of the Red Star and the Patriotic War. His detachment, which landed in the first wave of the assault on Shumshu Island, bore the brunt of the Japanese defense. When the landing barges approached the shore on August 18, 1945, Shutov's Marines were the first to jump into the cold water. Under a hurricane of enemy fire, they overcame the coastal strip and began to advance towards the key height 171. The Japanese met them with a barrage of fire from numerous pillboxes and shelters. At a critical moment in the battle, when Japanese tanks launched a counterattack, a group of Marines, led by Lieutenant Vilkov, found themselves cut off from the main forces. Ammunition was running low, and communication with command was interrupted. But even in this seemingly hopeless situation, the Soviet soldiers did not falter. Having expended their last cartridges, they engaged in hand-to-hand combat with superior enemy forces. Lieutenant Nikolai Vilkov and Sergeant Pyotr Ilyachev performed a feat that forever inscribed their names in the history of the Great Patriotic War. When the advance of the Marines was blocked by fire from a Japanese pillbox, both warriors rushed forward and covered the embrasures with their bodies, repeating the immortal feat of Alexander Matrosov. At the cost of their own lives, they ensured the advance of their comrades and the success of the entire operation. Both were posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. No less dramatic is the story of the artillerymen of Senior Lieutenant Stepan Ponomarev's battery. When Japanese tanks broke through to the landing positions, his crews bore the main impact. Rolling their guns out for direct fire, the artillerymen engaged in an unequal battle with the enemy's armored vehicles. Ponomarev himself personally knocked out several tanks, setting an example for his fighters. One of the participants in those events, Sergeant Alexei Kravchenko, later recalled, "We saw the battery commander standing by the gun, calmly aiming it at the approaching tanks. Shells exploded around, bullets whizzed, but he seemed not to notice the danger. His calmness spread to us, giving us strength and confidence." Special mention should be made of the feat of the signalmen, who ensured communication between various landing units. In mountainous terrain and under enemy fire, they laid communication lines, often at the cost of their own lives. Private Mikhail Vlasov, having received a severe wound, continued to maintain communication between the landing headquarters and the advanced units. Bleeding, he transmitted the last message about the advance of Japanese tanks, which allowed the command to timely redeploy reserves to the threatened direction. The medical personnel of the landing also showed exceptional courage and self-sacrifice. Military medic Anna Shchetinina, the only woman in the first wave of the landing, organized a field medical post right on the shore, under enemy fire. During the first day of fighting, dozens of wounded passed through her hands. Many of them owe their lives to her. When a Japanese shell exploded near the medical post, Anna, having received a shrapnel wound, continued to provide assistance to the soldiers. For many participants in the Kuril operation, these battles were the last in their military biographies. Sergeant Grigory Sidorenko, who went through the entire war, from the Brest fortress to Berlin, died on the last day of fighting for Shumshu Island. He did not live to see the official end of World War II by just a few hours. There were hundreds of such stories, the fates of people for whom the war ended not with a celebratory salute in Moscow, but with the last battle on distant Pacific islands. A special page in the history of the Kuril operation is made up of the fates of those who were transferred to the Far East from the European theater of operations. Many of them had just survived the storming of Berlin, witnessed the raising of the victory banner over the Reichstag, and participated in the victory parade. And instead of a long-awaited return home, they went to a new front, thousands of kilometers from their native places. Sergeant Vasily Petrenko, a tankman, participant in the Battle of Kursk and the liberation of Prague, recalled, "When we were informed about the transfer to the Far East, many were disheartened. It seemed that the war was already over, that we had fought our part. But then, already in the Kurils, when we saw with what fury the Japanese resisted, we understood we couldn't do without us here. It was also our duty to put the final point in this war." The human dimension of the Kuril operation is not limited only to heroic deeds. It also involved simple human feelings, fear of the unknown, longing for home, weariness from long years of war. And all the more significant is the feat of these people who, overcoming all human weaknesses, fulfilled their military duty to the end. Today, when we talk about the Kuril operation, it is important to remember not only its strategic significance or political consequences. First and foremost, it is the story of people, those who, at the cost of their own lives, put the final point in humanity's bloodiest war. Their feat will remain for centuries as a symbol of courage, fortitude, and selfless love for the motherland. On August 23, 1945, a historic scene unfolded on board a Soviet minesweeper swaying on the waves in the Bay of Shumshu Island. A Japanese military delegation, led by Lieutenant General Tsutsumi Fusaki, commander of the Kuril garrison, ascended the gangway. The faces of the officers, raised in the spirit of the Bushido Code, were stone. For them, accustomed to the idea that death was better than dishonor, this moment was harder than death itself. In the ship's cramped cabin, a table draped in red cloth had been set up. On it lay a document, the act of complete and unconditional surrender of Japanese troops in the Kuril Islands. The Soviet side was represented by Major General Alexei Gnechko, the man under whose leadership a brilliant amphibious operation had been carried out. When General Tsutsumi took the pen, his hand trembled. For a Japanese officer raised in samurai traditions, signing the surrender was tantamount to a personal defeat. Many of the Japanese officers present could not hold back tears, not from fear of captivity, but from the realization of the collapse of everything they believed in. One of the Soviet officers present at the ceremony later recalled, "We saw before us not just a defeated enemy. We saw the collapse of an entire philosophy, an entire worldview. These people were ready to die for their emperor, but they were not ready for defeat." After the signing of the act, the practical implementation of the surrender terms began. Special commissions were established on all islands of the archipelago to receive weapons and military equipment. Japanese soldiers, who just yesterday were ready to fight to the last drop of blood, now organizedly laid down rifles, machine guns, and artillery pieces. All weapons were carefully accounted for, sorted, and stored under the guard of Soviet sentries. Particular attention was paid to the acceptance of heavy equipment, tanks, artillery systems, radar stations. Many samples of Japanese weaponry were of significant interest to Soviet specialists. Engineering groups meticulously studied the design of Japanese fortifications, underground communications, and power supply systems. In parallel with the disarmament of Japanese troops, the fate of the civilian population of the islands was decided. In the southern Kurils, Itarup, Kunashir, Shikotan, several thousand Japanese civilians resided, fishermen, cannery workers, and their families. According to international agreements, they were subject to repatriation to Hokkaido. The Soviet command organized the evacuation of the civilian population with maximum respect for the people. Japanese families were allowed to take personal belongings, household utensils, and family heirlooms with them. Special transport vessels provided with food and medical personnel were allocated for transportation. Many Japanese who feared cruel treatment by Soviet troops were surprised by the correctness and humanity of the victors. One of the Japanese civilians, Takeo Sato, later recalled, "We were frightened and didn't know what to expect. Our whole life was collapsing, but the Russian officers treated us with respect. We were allowed to take everything we could carry. No one was subjected to humiliation or insults." Temporary camps were organized for Japanese prisoners of war, where acceptable living conditions were provided. The wounded received medical assistance in the same hospitals where Soviet soldiers were treated. Many Japanese soldiers and officers, raised on notions of Russian barbarians, were struck by the humane attitude towards them. An important aspect of the operation's completion was the documentation of all its stages. War correspondents and photographers recorded the process of the Japanese troops' surrender, the receipt of trophy weapons, and the evacuation of the civilian population. These materials had not only historical but also political value, confirming the legality of the Soviet Union's actions in restoring control over the Kuril Islands. By the end of August 1945, the process of accepting the surrender of Japanese troops in the Kuril Islands was largely completed. Over 80,000 Japanese soldiers and officers laid down their arms. Soviet troops acquired rich trophies, hundreds of artillery pieces, dozens of tanks, warehouses with ammunition, food, and equipment. But the main result of the operation was the restoration of historical justice, the return to Russia of territories lost after the defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904–1905. Thus ended the Kuril Operation, the last military operation of World War II. The Soviet flag raised over the Kuril Islands symbolized not only a military victory, but also the final conclusion of the bloodiest conflict in human history. The successful completion of the Kuril operation had far-reaching geopolitical consequences, the significance of which is still felt today, decades after the end of World War II. For the Soviet Union, it was not merely a military victory. It was the restoration of historical justice and the return of territories lost by Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. Geopolitically, the return of the Kuril Islands fundamentally altered the strategic balance in the northern Pacific Ocean. The USSR not only restored its historical borders in the Far East, but also gained control over key straits connecting the Sea of Okhotsk with the Pacific Ocean. This provided the Soviet Pacific Fleet with free access to the open ocean, an opportunity that Russia had been deprived of after its defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904–1905. The strategic importance of the archipelago cannot be overstated. The Kuril Islands form a natural frontier protecting the Russian Far East. Control over them allows for monitoring the movement of warships and submarines of potential adversaries, provides bases for aviation, and enables the deployment of early warning systems. In essence, the Kurils became the forward line of defense for our country's eastern borders. For Japan, the loss of the Kuril Islands became one of the most painful consequences of its defeat in World War II. The archipelago had not only military strategic, but also economic significance. Rich fishing grounds in the adjacent waters, mineral deposits, and geothermal energy sources all made the Kurils an important economic asset. Furthermore, for Japanese national identity, the question of ownership of the, quote, zero, as they call the Southern Kurils, became a symbol of post-war territorial losses. However, it is precisely here that one of the main geopolitical problems stemming from the Kuril operation is rooted. Unlike other territorial changes that occurred after World War II, the question of the Kuril Islands' ownership remains a subject of diplomatic dispute between Russia and Japan to this day. The roots of this problem lie in the specifics of the post-war settlement. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the leaders of the three great powers, the USSR, the USA, and Great Britain, agreed to transfer the Kuril Islands to the Soviet Union. This agreement was enshrined in a corresponding document signed by Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. However, after Roosevelt's death and Harry Truman's ascent to power in the USA, the American position on the Kuril issue began to change. Growing tensions between the former Allies and the onset of the Cold War led the USA to reconsider its attitude towards the Yalta agreements. When the peace treaty with Japan was signed in San Francisco in September 1951, the Soviet Union refused to sign it. One of the reasons was that the treaty did not explicitly state the transfer of the Kuril Islands to the USSR, although Japan renounced all rights to them. This legal conflict laid the groundwork for future territorial claims. Japan, supported by the USA, began to interpret the term Kuril Islands in such a way as to exclude the islands of Itarup, Kunashir, Shikotan, and the Habomai Island group. According to the Japanese version, these territories were never part of the Kuril archipelago, but were part of Hokkaido Island, and therefore, the provisions of the Yalta Agreement did not apply to them. The Soviet Union, and subsequently Russia, consistently upheld the position that all Kuril Islands, including the southern ones, legally passed under Soviet sovereignty as a result of World War II. This position is based on both the Yalta Agreements and the fact of the island's military liberation by Soviet troops. The absence of a peace treaty between Russia and Japan to this day is a direct consequence of the unresolved Kuril issue. Over the past decades, numerous attempts have been made to find a compromise solution, but none have led to a final settlement of the problem. However, despite diplomatic complexities, the strategic importance of the Kuril Islands for our country's security remained unchanged throughout the Cold War and persists today. In the context of confrontation with the West, control over this archipelago provided the Soviet Union with reliable protection for its far eastern borders and the ability to project power in the Pacific region. Military bases, radar stations, and air defense facilities were deployed on the Kuril Islands. Ships of the Pacific Fleet constantly patrolled the surrounding waters. All of this created a reliable shield protecting our country's eastern borders during the most tense years of the Cold War. The economic importance of the Kuril Islands is also difficult to overestimate. The richest fishing grounds in the adjacent waters provided a significant portion of the fish catch in the Far East. Deposits of sulfur, polymetallic ores, gold, and other minerals formed the basis for the development of the mining industry. The unique natural conditions of the archipelago opened up opportunities for the development of tourism and recreational activities. Today, as the world has entered a new era of geopolitical rivalry, the importance of the Kuril Islands only continues to grow. Control over this strategic archipelago ensures Russia's presence in the Asia-Pacific region, which is becoming a new center of world politics and economics. The Kurils remain a key element of the security system on our country's eastern borders. The Kuril operation of August 1945, therefore, had far-reaching consequences that extended far beyond military history. It changed the geopolitical map of the region, created a new reality in international relations, and ensured the security of our country's eastern borders for decades to come. It was not just the last operation of World War II, it was an operation that determined the future of an entire region for many years ahead. Despite its historical significance, the Kuril operation long remained in the shadow of other events of World War II. In Soviet historiography, The main focus was on the defeat of the Kwantung Army in Manchuria, while the details of the battles for the Kuril Islands were mentioned only in passing. Many veterans of these battles bitterly noted that their exploits did not receive due recognition and coverage in historical literature and textbooks. The reasons for such oblivion were varied. Firstly, the scale of the Kuril operation was incommensurable with the grand battles on the Western Front. 9,000 Soviet paratroopers against 80,000 Japanese soldiers seemed an insignificant episode after the multi-million-strong armies that clashed in the battles for Moscow, Stalingrad, or Berlin. Secondly, the political situation around the Kuril Islands complicated the objective coverage of events. The unresolved territorial issue with Japan made this topic sensitive for Soviet diplomacy. Even in the memoirs of military leaders, disproportionately little attention was paid to the Kuril operation. In the memoirs of Marshal Vasilevsky, who commanded the entire Far Eastern campaign, only a few paragraphs are devoted to the operations to liberate the Kuril Islands. Admiral Yumashev, commander of the Pacific Fleet, also only briefly mentions these events in his memoirs. The situation began to change only in the 1980s, when many archival documents were declassified and memoirs of direct participants in the battles began to be published. For the first time, the general public learned about the heroism of the paratroopers who stormed Height 171, about the feat of Lieutenant Vilkov and Petty Officer Ilyachev, and about the courage of the artillerymen of Ponomarev's battery. Local historians and local lore specialists of Sakhalin and Kamchatka played a special role in preserving the memory of the Kuril operation. It was they who painstakingly collected eyewitness accounts, documents, photographs, and created the first exhibitions in local history museums. Thanks to their efforts, the names of many heroes who had previously remained unknown were established. An important step was the creation of a memorial complex on Shumshu Island in the 70s. The monument to the heroes of the Kuril landing was erected on the very spot where the first Soviet soldiers landed. Every year in August, solemn events were held there, attended by veterans of the operation from different parts of the Soviet Union. With the collapse of the USSR and the opening of many archives, interest in the Kuril operation significantly increased. Historians gained access to previously classified documents, which allowed them to reconstruct the full picture of the events of August 1945. Dozens of scientific works, monographs, and collections of documents dedicated to this topic were published. Especially valuable were the memoirs of participants from both sides. In the 90s, Japanese historians also began to actively research the events of the Kuril operation, publishing memoirs of their veterans. Comparing Soviet and Japanese sources allowed for the creation of a more objective and multifaceted picture of the last battles of World War II. In the 2000s, the topic of the Kuril operation reached a new level of public attention. Documentaries were made, and internet resources dedicated to these events were created. Search teams began work at the battle sites, discovering wartime artifacts and the remains of fallen soldiers. Today, the Kuril operation is gradually taking its rightful place in the historical memory of our people. Scientific conferences are held annually, new research is published, and expeditions to the battle sites are organized. The feat of the Soviet soldiers, who put the final point in humanity's most bloody war, is finally receiving deserved recognition and perpetuation. The restoration of historical memory about the Kuril operation has not only scientific, but also important political significance. In the context of ongoing territorial disputes with Japan, the objective coverage of the events of August 1945 serves as a reminder of the legitimate grounds for Russian sovereignty over the Kuril Islands. The Kuril operation was not merely the concluding chord of World War II, but a symbolic finale to an entire epoch of world history. When the Soviet flag was raised over Shumshu Island, it marked not only a military victory, but also the definitive end to humanity's most destructive conflict. For the Soviet Union, the return of the Kuril Islands held multifaceted significance, extending far beyond military strategy or political ambitions. It was a restoration of historical justice, a return of territories that Russia had lost after an unsuccessful war with Japan at the beginning of the 20th century. For a country that had endured incredible trials in the fight against Nazism, this became a symbol of the ultimate overcoming of past historical traumas. The Kurils transformed into the eastern outpost of the state, ensuring the security of vast territories in the Far East and free access to the Pacific Ocean. Thousands of Soviet soldiers, many of whom had fought the entire war from Moscow to Berlin, did not give their lives in vain on the rocky shores of distant islands. Their feat ensured the strategic security of our motherland's eastern borders for many decades to come. Without control over the Kuril archipelago, the Pacific Fleet would have been effectively locked in its bases, deprived of the opportunity for free access to the ocean expanses. The very configuration of the island chain, stretching from Kamchatka to Japan, creates a natural frontier, control over which is critically important for ensuring the security of the entire Russian Far East. Today, as the center of world politics and economy increasingly shifts to the Asia-Pacific region, the strategic importance of the Kuril Islands only grows. They remain a key element of Russia's national security system in the eastern direction, ensuring control over vital maritime communications. The economic significance of the archipelago is also difficult to overestimate. The richest fishing grounds in the adjacent waters, mineral deposits, unique natural landscapes that create the basis for tourism development. All this makes the Kurils a crucial economic asset. In recent years, the Russian government has paid special attention to developing the island's infrastructure, improving the quality of life for the local population, and creating conditions for economic growth. However, the international aspect of the Kuril Islands issue cannot be ignored. The territorial dispute with Japan, unresolved to this day, remains one of the main obstacles to the full development of Russian-Japanese relations. Tokyo continues to claim 4 southern islands of the Kuril chain, referring to them as northern territories. The absence of a peace treaty between our countries is a direct consequence of this unresolved issue. Russia's position in this dispute remains unchanged. The Kuril Islands became part of our country based on the results of World War II on legitimate grounds, enshrined in international agreements. Russia's sovereignty over these territories is undeniable and not subject to revision. At the same time, Moscow demonstrates its readiness for dialogue on a wide range of issues of bilateral cooperation, including joint economic activities on the islands. It is important to remember that the Kuril operation of August 1945 had not only military, but also deep moral significance. It became a symbol of ultimate victory over militarism, aggression, and colonial ambitions. Soviet soldiers and officers who stormed the rocky shores of the Kuril Islands fought not just for the return of lost territories, they were putting the final point in the most terrible war in human history. For modern Russia, preserving the memory of the feat of the participants in the Kuril operation is not only a tribute to the heroic past, but also an important element of national self-awareness. The history of the liberation of the Kuril Islands reminds us of the price our people paid for victory in World War II, of the heroism of those who fulfilled their military duty until the very last day. Today, when some countries are attempting to revise the outcomes of World War II, to diminish the role of the Soviet Union in the defeat of fascism and militarism, It is especially important to preserve and pass on to new generations the truth about those events. The Kuril operation is an integral part of this truth, a reminder that our country made a decisive contribution not only to the victory over Nazi Germany, but also to the final defeat of Japanese militarism. Thousands of Soviet soldiers who gave their lives on the rocky shores of distant islands deserve to have their feat remembered by the people. The names of the heroes of the Kuril landing, Lieutenant Vilkov, Senior Sergeant Ilyichev, Senior Lieutenant Ponomarev, and many others, should be known to everyone interested in the history of our country. Their courage and self-sacrifice serve as an example for new generations of defenders of the fatherland. The Kuril operation of August 1945 will remain in history as the last chord of humanity's bloodiest war, as an operation that put the final point in a long-standing confrontation with the forces of aggression and militarism. The restoration of control over the Kuril Islands ensured the security of our country's eastern borders and created conditions for peaceful development for many decades to come. The memory of this victory is our national heritage, which we are obliged to preserve and pass on to future generations.